I just started it now, so because it will record to my account, so then I can like do all those kind of different, all the admin stuff. So we started recording now, and I can pause the recording as well. So we're all good.
Okay, right then. So let's get started. Okay, hi, welcome to the Growing Your Voice session with Vikki and Matthew. I am Vikki. My colleague Matthew is here. It would be great if you would like to tell us what your name is and what department you're in, and if you have any questions, pop them in the chat and we will answer questions at the end, or maybe have a little bit of a discussion depending on how things go. So yes, so my name is Vikki Barry-Brown, and I am one half of the job role of HSS PGR faculty rep, and I job share that with Matthew, and we were elected in, I think it was February this year, and we've also been re-elected, so we will be the representatives for the HSS faculty for the whole of next year as well. So that's, well, we think that's great. Matthew, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, so I'm Matthew. I'm the other half of the PGR HSS faculty rep, along with Vikki. And just to say as well, we're both third-year PhD students in the School of Geography. And in addition to this role, I'm also the course rep for Human Geography PhD students. And yeah, I think the next thing we're going to get on to is kind of just giving a brief overview of what QMSU is and sort of what we do.
Yeah, sure. So in order to talk about growing your voice within your school and department, we thought it would be really good to give a little bit of an overview of the student union and how we came into our roles. Because before we did come into these roles, we actually knew very little about QMSU, despite us being students at Queen Mary for a couple of years at that point. And so we thought we'd like to talk about that. So first of all, what is QMSU? Queen Mary Student Union is a student union. What does that mean? A student union or an association, or another name that it might have, is a student-run group that dedicates its time and resources to give the whole student community of the university fairness, opportunities, and a voice. Queen Mary Students' Union is a democratic membership organisation, and it's the voice of all Queen Mary students. And it is involved in representation, it's involved in activities, there's all sorts going on, and it is for all students. So whether you're an undergraduate, postgraduate talk, master's student, or a postgraduate researcher. Each year, the student union is led by a team of elected representatives. So these are full-time paid positions, and they're led by the president. And then there's 5 vice presidents, who you might also sometimes hear called SABS officers, that's short for sabbaticals. So at Queen Mary, the vice presidents cover welfare, communities. Then there's faculty reps, so covering 3 faculties, which is HSS, Science and Engineering, and Arts and London. And today Cameron and Tiana are here, and they are the HSS and Communities VPs respectively. So we're not going to go fully into the detail of all of the nuts and bolts of the union, but what we wanted to say is there's part-time reps, and that's what Matthew and I are. So the faculty reps are part-time. And then there are school reps. So there's a school rep for each school/department, and they're also part-time reps. That doesn't mean they get paid part-time. They don't get paid at all. It's volunteers. We do it because we love it. But there's other part-time roles as well that are outside of that educational structure. There's a lot of information about this on the QMSU website. So as well as school reps, sorry, to go back to that, school reps. So school reps are part-time reps, and they are often undergraduates, but they can actually be taken on by any student. So a postgraduate would go for those positions, and their job is to represent the interests of the students within that school. And then there are course reps. So course reps are just, it sounds representing a course. For example, Matthew is a course rep for geography. So when it comes to postgraduate researchers, there tends to be a postgraduate rep for each subject. So they'll all be doing different research projects, but for example, in geography, there is a human geography rep and a physical geography rep for postgraduates. So another part of QMSU is Student Council.
And that's my cue. So Student Council is, I suppose, kind of the I don't know, the summit that happens about at least 4 times a year for all part-time officers. And it is kind of the governing body of the Students' Union. Well, it is the governing body of the Students' Union, at least as it relates to student experience, and it is what drives the actions of the Students' Union to support students. So Student Council is made up of approximately 50 part-time officers, but they're also attended by the Student Union's executive officers. However, the executive officers do not vote in that capacity in the Student Council. So Student Council, the core aspect of it is kind of discussing motions, which are motions are what are effectively the laws that create actions by the Students' Union. Motions can be submitted by any part-time officer or any student, as long as they are seconded, or they can be submitted by a student, but they have to be seconded and supported by two additional part-time officers, if I'm hopefully explaining that correctly. In addition to Student Council, there are various subcommittees, and the subcommittees are sort of like mini student councils for various aspects of student experience, such as education, communities, and sustainability. There's also a newly mentioned international and postgraduate board. And these boards also write motions that are then fed up through Student Council. And the thing that I really want to impress upon anybody watching this video back is that Student Council can be attended by any student, and any student, doesn't matter if you're undergraduate, postgraduate taught, or postgraduate research, you are eligible to attend Student Council and participate in it in its entirety, with the exception of having a vote on the motions. And I would really encourage everyone to get involved and come to these meetings, because it really is the crux of how change happens as it relates to the Students' Union liaising with the university. I think that's everything I want to mention on Student Council, unless Vikki thinks there's something that really needs to be added. So with that, we're going to continue on just with speaking about sort of essentially how we found our student voice through this role. And I guess I can start with saying that we really became more aware and involved of the Students' Union sort of really halfway through the COVID-19 pandemic. Because admittedly, as postgraduate research students, I can at least speak for myself, and I think Vikki might agree that we, or at least I, was not very aware of what the Students' Union did or how it could support me as a postgraduate research student. And so essentially what we had done at the beginning of the pandemic within our own School of Geography was to try to put pressure on our department, who were not being as supportive as they maybe could have done to the PhD students. And that sort of snowballed into liaising with many different PhD students across the university. And that went into a group that I'm gonna let Vikki speak a bit more on.
Sure, yeah, this led to a cross-departmental group of many different PhD students. And it was really interesting, I think, because not only were we all having difficulties around COVID, it also really showed up the way that PhDs are treated differently in different departments. And so if you're only really, because doing a PhD can be quite an isolating experience. There's a lot of research on this that has said this, and also knowing from my own experience as well and talking to other people. So quite often you might not often talk to people within your department. So talking to people outside of the department was a revelation, because you suddenly find out, oh, wow. So if you're in science, you might get quite a lot more money than you might do in, say, history or something like that to support your research project. So it was really fascinating to find that out. But also it was great coming together, because there's definitely a strength if you've got a handful of students in one department talking about one issue, but actually you then got students across the board from lots of different subject areas raising an issue. It can't just be dismissed as, oh, that is a geography thing, or that's an arts thing, or that's a humanities thing. This is something that is impacting a cross section of students and needs to be taken seriously. So I think with that kind of strength in voice and coming together, then it's really possible to make a bit of an impact. And yeah, the group wrote letters together, so wrote public letters and got them signed. There's petitions. And yeah, it was also just a really, and the group is still going. It's a really good way to get people together and talking.
And so then from that group, I think about maybe around the same time, I think Cameron and Tiana and Aphrodite, who are all VPs and sabbatical officers, as we've mentioned previously, as well as a couple of professional staff from the Students' Union, started attending meetings as well. And that's when we really learned more about what the Students' Union did, and essentially what role was not currently filled, which is the role that we're doing as faculty PGR reps. And we decided that through that understanding and discussion, we learned about the kind of the way that the representation chain was effectively broken, because our role is really the kind of the link between students and the Doctoral College and senior management. And so effectively, without that role kind of existing, there isn't a clear way to kind of have continuous feedback. And so what we did, we decided to run for election, and were elected to this role. And what that means is that we now take part in student council, and we are able to speak regularly with the Doctoral College and represent our students within HSS, or our PhD students. So what we do is we meet with the Doctoral College, as I said. We also comment on policies and proposals that the university is working on, so just signing into its own governance that affects PhD students. And we gather feedback from PGRs within different schools and departments in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and we feed that to the Students' Union and the Doctoral College. And as Vikki mentioned before, we're able to speak cross-departmentally to find out what's working in one department, but what's not working in another, and how we might be able to take sort of actions that are happening in one department and sort of create those similar actions or models in other departments to basically kind of increase or make better the PhD student experience. And Vikki, do you want to add anything else in that kind of that aspect? I just want to make sure that I'm I want to make sure I'm touching on all major points. You
mentioned the email situation, didn't you?
No, not yet. Why? No, that's in the next.
That's fine.
Yes, I totally missed that cue. I'm so sorry. So Vikki is now going to speak as well. One of our there were right before we ran for election, we submitted a motion to the all students annual meeting, which is basically a very large student council. And actually, I should mention that as far as going back to what student council is as well, because the annual all students meeting allows any student to submit a motion independent of the usual process. And it's a very large meeting. I think, I think you all hopefully can corroborate what I'm about to say, but do we have about 700 people at one point in that meeting? So it was very significant. And Vikki and I submitted a motion based on the other kinds of communication breakdown above and beyond the break in the kind of the representation web due to the role that we are now in being unfulfilled. And so on our platform was fixing this ongoing communication issue that Vikki is now going to speak at greater length about.
Yeah, so the email issue was essentially that the student union QMSU sends out every week an email that tells you a little bit about what's going on, what's been happening, things that you can sign up to, and just all this really informative stuff. And this is part of the reason that we weren't very aware of what the student union did, was because we weren't getting those emails. Now, we both started in September 2018, and for the whole time up until very recently, we were not getting the emails. And then we found out that more people were getting the emails. And I think in the end, it turned out that only about a third of the current PhD population were actually receiving those emails, which would go a long way to explaining why PhDs often told us that they were not aware of QMSU or what QMSU did, or that it was even relevant to them as postgraduate students. So that was one of the things in the motion that Matthew spoke about that we really wanted to get fixed. And we have worked with staff members in QMSU, and which has been fantastic. It's been really, really interesting finding out how, not just how a student union works or what it does, but who are the people that you never get to see because they're not the VPs. They're the people that work all the time for the student union. So that was really great getting to work with these people and trying to find out what the problem was, which, you know, the inconvenience of the problem notwithstanding, also very, very fun. It was almost like detective work. And so the communications team at QMSU not managed to solve the actual problem, but have managed to find a temporary workaround, which means that we now get the emails. And I was incredibly excited to get the email, and it sounds like hyperbole, but I was more excited than I thought I would be. I messaged Matt and said, Matt, I have a QMSU email. So that was great. So that's one of the things that we wanted to do. And, you know, I'm really glad that we've done that. So another thing that we wanted to do was to fix the communication blockades that Matthew spoke about. So one of the things is we're thinking about feedback. Now, if you are a PhD student and you have an issue that your department can't solve, or it's not appropriate for your department to try and do something about it, who do you speak to? How do you get that information across? We were a little bit like, we knew about the Doctoral College because we had an induction. You get a lot of information at the Doctoral College induction, which, you know, if you're a PhD, you'll know all about that. It's a lot to take in. And also, it's not always clear what the Doctoral College is or does. So we thought, well, maybe you speak to the Doctoral College. We don't know. Now we know that because they have because QMSU has the rep structure, the Doctoral College and other departments and factions of the university rely on QMSU to have this structure in place, so that rather than people like the staff members who work in the Doctoral College having to contact many students to try and get opinions, that they can go to QMSU and say, send your postgraduate reps, and that they will go to a meeting and have these conversations. So coming to this realization, but also knowing that postgraduates aren't necessarily in these positions is a problem. So once we got into this position, we wanted to try and ensure that the different schools and departments have PGR school reps, because again, in HSS faculty, and this is the faculty we know the most about, there isn't a rep in each school or department. So again, if you've got an issue, you would go to your school rep. But if you don't have a school PGR rep, where do you go at that point? So this is something that we've been wanting to look into. Another thing that we wanted to talk about with people to see if it was feasible was the potential to have a vice president for postgraduates in the future, in addition to the 5 that are already in place. So other universities have this, as I mentioned at the top, and it is something that could maybe be a possibility, because this would be a person who would have, because at the moment, looking after postgraduates is mainly, Tiana, it's mainly in your role description, right? But also Cameron works on it as well. And they have been putting together Project Doctorate, which you will hear more about in the future. So they've been doing absolutely fantastic work, and it's great. We were wondering if it would be impossible to have a person who solely looks after postgraduate things and could maybe help out with more of this good work that Cameron and Tiana have been doing. So that's something that we wanted to look into as well. So those were the things that we wanted to do. And I have talked a little bit about solving the email issue, which has preempted some of the stuff that Matthew's going to say. I will hand over to Matthew for that, if there's anything else that you wanted to add before I talk about some of the other stuff that we did.
On the email issue, I think just that I guess I want to impress upon those watching this back, just that it's communication infrastructure, even within the university, is, as we found, it's quite complicated. And so it's, as Vikki mentioned, that QMSU hasn't been able to solve the email issue. I would say it's not their fault or the university's fault. It's just a confluence of problems that is a bit like, I really enjoy the Spider-Man meme where everyone's pointing at each other. Like it's a bit like that. I do think it's going to take some time to get to the bottom of, but I think what we've learned in this role, kind of going through this sort of this detective work, is that people really need to talk to each other, because the reason that this hasn't been solved is because people there's not enough communication between the various parties that could solve this. So that's something that we're kind of actively working towards through QMSU and the Doctoral College. And so now I think that Vikki is going to expand upon communication, particularly around us making sure that we're in contact with all of the HSS PGR course reps and the kind of information and sort of representation aspects we've been gathering from them in our meetings and discussions.
Yes, so as we've mentioned already, we get called upon to comment on things like policy, and we also go to meetings with people like the Doctoral College and department heads, things like that. And as much as we could let the power go completely to our heads and just make up and say what we want and what we really want out of it, we do actually want to find out what the views are of PhDs. And again, as much as we would love to go around and talk to everybody, that would be a lot of PhDs to talk to. So what we need to do is make sure that there is a working system throughout the schools and departments so that we can ask questions, or we can ask for feedback. We can ask people how things are going on in their departments, if there's any issues that need to be raised, or if there's any information that we need to give. For that to happen, we need it to have a working structure. So we did some research, because I guess that's what we do. We do research, so we just thought we'd do some more research. And we had meetings with the reps that are currently in place in HSS in the various schools with the PGR reps. We talked to them about how they came to the roles, how they felt supported, and if they had involvement with QMSU. So they were really interesting. People had really come to positions in a variety of ways. More often than not, people had their director of graduate studies had asked if anybody wanted to be a rep, and there was a resounding silence. So quite often the directors of graduate studies would then pick a person who thought they thought might be good at the job and say, hey, you'd be really good at this. Do you know what? It would look great on your CV. And that's how somebody ends up doing a rep role for 3 years. So yeah, it was really eye-opening to see what's happening in other departments. And we looked at different bits of paperwork. We looked at how representation was supposed to work, not only within QMSU. The university also has standards and commitments to working with students to ensure that student voice is heard and is part of the construction of the university and what the university's values are. So we put all of that together, and we have written a lovely big report that we worked on for quite a few weeks. And last week we were able to send out the finalized version of that to the Doctoral College, to QMSU, and we're hoping to put in place from the autumn a new structure. So should I talk about the new structure?
We could say, I mean, just I guess briefly, maybe the fact that there's going to be PGR specific elections. I think that
yeah, this is what we're hoping. We've had broad agreement and encouraging noises from the people who matter. I mean, everyone matters. I mean, the people who can do the magic one thing and make this work. But yeah, looking at the potential for having dedicated postgraduate elections that are more in line with the postgraduate or the postgraduate research year, which does inevitably work differently to other students. A semantic issue of calling reps subject reps as opposed to course reps, so it more accurately reflects what they are and who they are representing. Another thing that we'd identified is that QMSU has a really simple kind of bullet point situation describing what you would be expected to do as a rep. What we found when we spoke to representatives in schools is that schools were adding on many other responsibilities and points, which make the role unwieldy, makes it unattractive, because if you're doing your research, you've probably got 1,001 other things going on. And if it's kind of like collect feedback from your fellow students, great. If it's collect feedback, organize a conference, in some cases find accommodation for new international students, that is a ridiculous workload. And whilst we wouldn't be saying that schools cannot ask people to do that, what we are proposing is that the QMSU rep is the QMSU rep, and they have the responsibilities set out by QMSU, and that is to ensure that the voice of the students within their subject are heard, amplified, passed on to the relevant people, so that we can really make sure that there's a good communication process in place.
So one example of that a very, very direct cue. One example of implementing like PGR student voice other than our own was a suggestion around, I guess I would call it around extending university affiliation for PhD students. And what that means is that once you've had your viva or your oral examination of your PhD research, then you're a doctor or you have the doctor title, that you continue to have access to library services for an extended amount of time. And that you're continue to be allowed to say that you're part of Queen Mary. And at the moment, I think there is the current extension or the current affiliation period. Is it something like 3 or 6 months?
I think it's closer to 3 than 6, but I'm not entirely sure of the exact. It's very short.
So then in fact, extending that will allow people the resources to continue publishing from their PhD research or write new articles while they're looking for a full-time job. As well as, I suppose, just generally have a place that they're still part of and that they can work within. And so what we've done is we've started speaking with, we've taken that request to the Doctoral College and proposed kind of the reasoning behind it and what is currently in place and how it could be better. And essentially we've been told that there's no real reason this can't happen. Historically, it's something that has been looked into, but the infrastructure hasn't been agreed upon by various parties that are responsible for it at the same time. But because we are in this role, we are able to take that request from that PGR student, make the case, and continue making it rather than it being sort of something that's a one and done or something that once an obstacle is been confronted with, that the proposal is dissuaded. So I think that just gives one example that's really concrete of how what we do in this role that really does takes that kind of amplified student voice and better student experience for PhD students. And that kind of goes hand in hand generally with the kind of experience of using the library.
Sure, yes, that was another thing that we did. We worked with Cameron actually and with the library to sort out an issue that's happened most years, but it's something that really became even more significant this year. And that is that because of the way that, well, with PhDs working all year round rather than sticking to the same, term format, we work all the time right through the summer. But because of the way departmental budgets work, it wasn't possible to ask for library books to be bought after a certain date, which I think was the end of April or maybe the end of May, I don't remember which, but basically for a period of about 3 months, you were not able to ask the library to buy in a book for you, which could be difficult because you might hit a point in your research where you think, I really need that book. And normally you would ask the library if they would buy it. And I have to say, every time I've asked the library to buy a book, they've bought the book, which has been great. But unfortunately, if it is in that time period previously, you wouldn't be able to get that. And we've spoken with the library, and so did Cameron. And for this year, that has been changed, and the library will be able to purchase books across the summer. So that, again, that's another example of something that was raised by a student and that we've been able to take away and come back with. And then another example that I was thinking of, we had a few people contact us who are unfunded PhD students who are concerned about being moved into the writing up period when they feel they still had work to do, and they had been told that they were not allowed to do field work within the writing up period. And this was something that we spoke to the Doctoral College about, and the Doctoral College said, no, it's a common misconception. You absolutely can do that. If you're transferred to writing up, you can still carry out new research. And I think that's something else that's been really highlighted, is that there's a lot of different information going around. And some of that is reasonable because the departments are different and do have different structures and rules. but equally, there's a lot of misinformation that goes around. And I think we're maybe going to talk about that a little bit later on.
So then the kind of one of the structures that we've implemented for ourselves in order to basically, how do I say this? Feedback the feedback, or the feedback of the feedback. Essentially being able to tell the PGR reps in each department or school within HSS what the Doctoral College has said, and basically just sort of keep them informed of what we're doing. And that is establishing a fortnightly newsletter in which we describe the actions that we've been up to. We let people know what they need to look out for and what's coming up that impacts them as PhD students. And we generally kind of ask them to continue doing good work and helping us do our jobs, and just sort of making Queen Mary a good place to be at. And so that included a newsletter typically that, at least at the moment, they usually get sent out on Tuesdays. And in this newsletter, we talked about the current funding extensions that are sort of still are being processed for those students that required additional information, or the COVID-19 extensions. Sorry, I'm falling over my words slightly there. And as well as sort of, you know, we highlighted that we were doing this event as well. So it's this sort of just general keeping people in the loop, keeping that communication open, making it accessible, making it something that can be easily passed around, and just sort of, yeah, it's just another kind of tool in our representation arsenal. I don't know.
I quite like that. It sounds a little bit violent, but I quite like it. I mean, I'm just going to stop there. Yeah, we've had a really good response to it as well. I was quite surprised because when we sent the first one out, it was just sent to the representatives or to the directors of graduate studies in the schools or departments that don't have representatives. But then I started to hear from people who had it passed on to them by their rep, which we hadn't actually said, please pass it on. I don't think we had in that first one. And that was great. So we started asking people to do that. And it was really wonderful to actually just get a surprise and have someone say, oh, we saw that newsletter you did. It's really good to know that stuff's going on and to hear about it. So yeah, so that's some of the stuff that we've been doing. Now, we said in the advertising for this event, we talk a little bit about the pitfalls that we faced as representatives and as PhD students in trying to pursue student voice. So we'll just talk about that, and then we're going to finish up by talking about how you can grow your voice within your department. So I'll start this off. So trying to find out who the representatives were in each school or department was really, really difficult. So the QMSU website wasn't up to date, which was, again, another one of those Spider-Man things that it was inevitable that the information was not getting to the right places. And there's not always the staff resources to ensure that everything is there at the specific time that it's required. So this just happens. I mean, this is, as a side note, probably, if you've ever worked outside of a university before then coming back to a university, the university bureaucracy will completely frustrate you, no end, absolutely no end, because you know that it doesn't need to be like this. If you have only ever been within a university, it's not always like this. So you might go somewhere else and it's completely different. So on the one hand, I would be really keen to say that university bureaucracy is frustrating, and to an extent you have to let some of that go over you a little bit and just accept it, but also only to a point. It shouldn't be like shrug, things are bad, whatever. So anyway, that was a complete side note there, but anyway, so the website is now up to date, which is fantastic. Like we say, you know, if you're asking for information from schools and departments are not forthcoming with that information, how is QMSU expected to keep that information up to date? So finding out who the reps were was challenging, but now that we have found out who the reps are, it's great because we got to know them and now they get our lovely newsletter. So did you want to speak a little bit about that process, Matthew?
Yeah, so I think something like there are links between schools and institutes, or twice with shorthanded department, for communication between QMSU and the university as it relates to just, I guess, holding records of who the reps are. But that person isn't necessarily in the same role per department. So finding out who we needed to speak to was not easy. And I think at least at one point, we might have had an email forwarded 3 times to get to the right person. And there were some staff members that didn't know what QMSU was, or that they should have reps. So it's this kind of, I guess it kind of goes hand in hand, or it falls back into what we were discussing, or what we kind of continue to discuss, that there are kind of gaps in the kind of the web or the chain of communication, that it's really important to, as Vikki said, not get overly frustrated with the university for that, acknowledge it, and at least understand that there are solutions. And I suppose that's also why we encourage people to get involved, and why we wanted to get involved, because it does seem as though they're relatively straightforward fixes. And if that's something that we can do, we should do it as students, because it's going to be better. It's going to better our experience, and it's going to better the experience of those that come after us. And I think, well, at least I can say for myself, I went into this role being quite cynical and distrustful of the university. And I don't necessarily think that, I guess I don't necessarily, how do I say this, regret my initial impression. But I guess I understand that I'm trying to be more understanding of myself because of COVID and the fact that we're having a lot of difficulty. Well, everyone was having difficulty, but particularly within our home department of geography, sort of understanding what was going on, and asking for things that and really needs that weren't being met. But I think that it's important to remember that, I suppose, disorganization or bureaucracy, it's typically neither malevolent or benevolent, and just have to remember not to be callous, and that there are quite often large chains of people that need to sign things off, that holds things up, and that is something that comes with the territory. So I suppose it's important to be kind of realistic, and I would just want to kind of impress that upon anybody that is interested in doing representation work, or just simply sort of what to expect when you use your student voice to interact with your representatives, and sort of the kind of the process that we go through to make change. And Vikki mentioned, again, if you worked outside academia, that certainly is frustrating. But I think an example that we mentioned earlier as well was kind of the extension of affiliation for PhD students after their oral examination or viva, because, I mean, it quite very bluntly told there's no ideological opposition to doing so, but that no one can get the library and the IT department to agree to implement it at the same time. So there's kind of a lot of this back and forth that becomes, you need creative solutions, I suppose is what I would say. So I think it's also a great way to build, I don't know, critical thinking and problem solving. And I suppose that's not just on the level of the large university, but it also takes place in your own school or department as well. And I think Vikki might touch on an aspect there.
Yeah, certainly. And I think as well, just to add to what you were just saying, I think that, like I say, decision making can take a really long time, and it's sometimes incredibly far removed from the student experience. So, you know, you could have somebody making a decision who maybe they went to university a very long time ago, or maybe they've had a very different pathway through the university or something like that. And they're so far, they're removed from the student experience. And so the impact of them missing a deadline to communicate some information to students, to them might not seem like a very big deal, but to somebody who's waiting for feedback on something like, say, a COVID extension funding or something like that, that's a really critical problem. a really critical problem. Like a day can make a really big difference. And somebody says they're going to do something, you expect them to do it. So it's not acceptable. So as much as, again, we kind of go, university bureaucracy, we also have to keep challenging these kind of situations. So yeah, so talking about pitfalls within departments that we've come across, I suppose more generally as PhD students, is things like missing out on funding that's available to you. If you're a funded PhD student, you really need to understand how you're funded, where your funding comes from, what are the conditions attached to it, and find out if you have a research allowance. So that's money that might be used towards field work or purchasing things that you need in order to do your research. There might be limitations on what you can buy with it. For example, some people might be able to buy I don't know, office equipment, other people might not. And it's unfair, but also it's because different funders have different stipulations and different requirements. You definitely need to know when money needs to be spent by. When I was in the first year, this wasn't communicated to me at all. Because I'd never done a PhD before, I didn't know that money given to me in the first year was not going to roll over into the second year. Did get it to roll over into the second year because I pointed out that nobody had made that information available to me. But, you know, ideally, this is the kind of information that would be made available to you at the beginning when you start your PhD. Unfortunately, we keep finding that this is not the case. So if possible, what you could do with doing is just trying to, you know, find out as much as you can about how you get your money. And also QMUCU and QMSU, I think both of those, finding out a little bit more about the unions. I actually come from a union background. I've worked in unions. I was very, very unfamiliar with unions in the case of education. And I do wish that I'd actually spent more time doing it. And I think a lot of the time with some of the more campaigny side of union stuff is sometimes it takes something bad happening for people to end up getting involved. And for me, that was certainly COVID. It comes to a kind of catastrophic thing occurring. You kind of go, oh, wow, so who speaks up for me? So that's another thing. Find out more about your unions. And probably a quick word on that is, if you're not familiar, QMSU looks after you as a student. Now, if you're a teaching assistant or a demonstrator, or you do any paid work like that, then the unions, that you need to look at the other unions for that part of that representation. QMSU can only represent you as a student. So yeah, so you would need to, if you had something like a teaching and there's a problem, QMSU could growing your voice, which is the bit that we've made you wait for. So Matthew, you're going to start this one off, aren't you?
Yes. So the first thing that I would really recommend for, I kind of think all students, but I think particularly PhD students, because I think, as Vikki mentioned, it can be quite isolating. You're often working on your own, where you can talk to each other. And so what I would recommend would be to start a group chat that could be just simply on phones. That could be using an app like Signal or WhatsApp or WeChat. That could be on Facebook. It could even be on Teams at this point. And I can say that we have one for our cohort in geography. And it's, quite frankly, it's a lifesaver, because where information is lacking, say just structurally within your department, you have the kind of the collective knowledge of your cohort and of those that are in the years above you that have already gone through the process that can help you. So an example of that is, this might vary depending on what department or faculty that you're in, but I think most PhDs have a progression component in which you are kind of at sort of a mini oral examination to sort of say you're a PhD candidate and sort of set your research methods and sort of questions, and it establishes that aspect of what you're going to be doing for the latter 2 years or 3 and writing up. And so what we've done in geography is we have shared one another's progression documents to those people that have asked, and like that's just a really significant advantage or helpful, not for reasons of like content, but for structure. I want to make it clear, not about plagiarism, but certainly knowing about the structure, how the document should be set out when they're isn't a guide, an extensive guide otherwise available. And so that's, I mean, and that's the thing, continue to talk to people about their experience. People are talking about their progression experiences as well, and sort of what to expect, what's normal, what's not, what kinds of things are you asked, what's the vibe, what's the mood, and just if you're unhappy about something, there could be something other people might be unhappy as well. So it's really important to talk to one another and to sort of organize and feedback, which that extends to positive aspects as well. If there are things that people like that are happening, you maybe want more of them to happen, such as various events, and that's something that is equally valid. So I also want to speak about sort of just general knowledge that is gained through these sort of conversations with one another, and that extends to getting to know your department. So as Vikki mentioned as well about funding and about the kind of the two sort of main unions that are part of the student experience, it also means just sort of understanding, like finding the borders, to use this geographical terms, problematic geographical terms, of your department, school, or institute. So what that means is, find out who the official PGR people are, then include your director of graduate studies, who is sort of responsible for, I suppose, your kind of the way that your experience of research culture is, as well as the kind of the person that it sort of sits above your supervisor as well liaises with the Doctoral College, or your research manager, postgraduate studies manager, or research administrator, if you have one of these that are slightly interchangeable, or their equivalents. And those are professional service staff, which basically are people that know everything that's going on about the department, and that can sort of aid you in whatever you might need, that sort of supports your PhD and with regards to infrastructure. And if there are any, I suppose, one example is, say, if there's a master's student looking to do a PhD afterwards, and the audience sort of playing this back. This is an example that I like to point to, because I did my master's at Queen Mary as well before the PhD. And our department offered its own binding for dissertations, which I guess I would assume they might do for theses as well. So it's these kinds of things that you may not, that aren't sort of, if they're not directly advertised, you find out by just speaking with one another. And these might be resources that are otherwise unspoken, and then you can share that with your cohort, and that increases everyone's experience. And I think, Vikki, do you want to add anything with that about school support?
Yeah, I was going to say that there's other roles that people in your department might have that might not be readily obvious to you. So you'll probably meet your director of graduate studies in the first week, or at various points. They should be regularly meeting with you, ideally, as a group. But there's other roles that people might have. So, for example, in geography, our postgraduate studies manager is also our school support officer, who has the remit to offer advice on matters that you feel may be impeding your ability to study. And that person as well, I believe, is also our link person with the Dyslexia and Disability Service. So, you've got people who wear many, many hats, but the hats are not always on the hat rack in full visibility. That's a terrible, terrible description there. But yeah, so basically, it's good to try and find out the other things that people do that might be relevant to you. So that I didn't know that there was a Dyslexia Disability Service link person within our department until I'd actually been part of the DDS service for a few months. So that was something that it would have been good to know about, really. And we have a library rep, don't we, Matthew?
We do have a library rep. That, I'll be honest, I mean, that's something that I need to do further work on. I'm not entirely certain everything that this rep does, but I expect that probably one aspect of the role is liaising, I suppose maybe particularly budgets, because schools contribute part of the book budget for the library to the library. But I imagine that questions could also be fielded through them if you might be having difficulty just, I suppose, getting the right contact at the library as well. And I think that extends to sort of finding out who wears the hat, but there might also be people that don't wear the hat, but are interested in the role. The hat. Maybe they want to wear the hat. They just don't want to wear the hat in official capacity.
Yeah, they want to rent the hat. They want to borrow the hat to go
There
out
we
for lunch.
go.
That's it. They want to borrow the hat. So you need to identify these responsive people who might be really useful to you. These might be academics that are super interested in supporting and happy to engage with postgraduate researchers, but don't want or have an official role. So these are people who can lobby for you within the department. They can advise you and maybe also run useful sessions for you. These might be people who are active in their own union, and they can also share their experiences quite often as early career researchers. So giving things like career advice or advice on publishing, all sorts of things really. But those people out there, they just might not have the official role that you are looking for.
And on that as well, I think sort of not finding out as much as you can and not taking things necessarily at face value or assuming things are set in stone. So as it relates to, finding somebody who's interested in what you're interested in and can support you, that might not be advertised as being part of the department in, I suppose, like official capacity. I think an example for me that I would like to sort of expand upon is on training as well. And that's training at the school or institute or departmental level, as well as within the Doctoral College. So I sort of made the wrong kind of assumption that the training provided or that is advertised is the only training that can occur. And so when I say training for PhD students, I mean, again, those things that happen locally, but also those events that happen through the skills, is it skills for either skills forge or the CPD booking. The main Queen Mary Academy training is what I'm trying to get across. And the more that we've engaged with our departments and with the Doctoral College, like, I guess and this goes back to, I don't know, not being cynical, and also trusting in benevolence that people do really want to make your experience better. And there is always scope to introduce new activities and events that are going to increase your capacity or knowledge as a researcher while you're effectively in your like research apprenticeship. And so I just think that if you're unhappy about something, talk to people in your cohort, talk to people in your department, talk to us, and
reach out to other people in other departments as well, because if you're unhappy about something, it might be that people in other departments are also unhappy about something, or it might be that they've gone through this already and they have great examples of what they are doing. And having a working example of what another department is doing to be able to take back to your own department and say, this is what they do in, I'm going to say history because history is great, and I'm not even in that department. You go to the history department and say, oh, what do you do about this? And they say, oh, we do this. And you go back and say, hey, history are doing this. We think this is fabulous. We would love this to happen where we are at now. So that's a really great thing to do. And see what you can do through the official channels. We'll come to unofficial in a moment, but speak to us, as Matthew has already said. Speak to your school rep. We haven't talked a lot about school reps, to be honest. That they are essentially looking after the school. Talk to your school rep, talk to your PGR rep. Ask them about the meetings that they go to within the department. Ask them if they will take your feedback, or ask them what happens at those meetings. What are the things that might be relevant to you as a student within your home department or departments, because people are supervised between more than one. Ask them to raise issues for you at meetings if that's appropriate. An example of this is, again, as we've referred to quite a few times, COVID support. So we wrote a letter to our department, and then when the department were not able to fulfill the things that we were requesting, that was then escalated, wider and differently. So it's kind of looking at those official channels and how can you push information, feedback, questions in and out of departments.
Sorry, Vikki, I'm just looking at the next point, and I just want to ensure, because I suppose this is the current system, but it might not, but it'll be different in our revised system. Should I mention how basically what it is currently? Just as an example.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Okay. So an aspect of this as well is that if your school or department doesn't have a rep, really, like, please consider sort of taking up that that role or that responsibility. And I think an aspect that we touched upon earlier is that schools often ask reps to do additional information beyond what those responsibilities are through QMSU. And I would just, think about how that role is meant to work for you, because it's through QMSU, and it's not about what you can do for the school, it's about what you can do for your cohort. And I think that's like something that's important to impress. So, an example of that might be job sharing. And we've done that now in geography as me as the QMSU course rep. There are 2 additional people who take on an addition or a secondary responsibility of the rep called Postgraduate Research Frameworks, which are, I suppose, more informal training sessions that are organized by PhD students for PhD students. So it's like, and essentially we just told the department that this is what's happening. And I guess I encourage you to, that is student voice, that is standing up for yourself, that is telling your department what you need and how you want it to function. Because at the end of the day, it's your experience, and it's your PhD, and it's your period of growth.
Absolutely. And that is something that I think gets quite easily lost when you're talking about anything to do with it. Your PhD should be your primary thing that you're doing. And anything else should be things that help you do your PhD. That's not to say you can't do other things. Of course you can, but it gets really lost in everything that, let's do this, let's organize that. Do your PhD. But also, if you feel that you have the time capacity to be a rep, and as Matthew says, you can job share it, something like that, great. But if that's not for you, and there is no representative in your school, ask your Director of Graduate Studies how they can get information to us or to your equivalent faculty rep if you're not in HSS, and also to the Doctoral College, because it is literally part of their role to do this. As I said, we've talked a lot here about working inside the structures, so that is through QMSU, through the Doctoral College, but you might want to think about working outside of the structures. So for example, the PhD Pandemic group that we've spoken about already, they're an example of this. So think about what you want to get across, because on the one hand, Matthew and I can get into all these various meetings, and we can get asked to comment on things. And in order to keep being invited into those rooms and to have a voice in these policies and to have a stake and things like that, we have to operate in a certain way. There's ways that we have to give our feedback. And that's just the way it is. But groups that work outside of these systems don't have to do that. And they may be in a position to say or do things that we aren't able to do. And that's why it's really important to have these structures, but it's also really important to have groups that work outside of the structures too. There's different ways in which people and structures can be held to account. But whilst you're doing all these, you need to look after yourself and be mindful of the amount of time that you're giving to things.
Because mental health matters in doing your PhD, and burnout is very real, as Vikki and I are very well aware. So I think, as we mentioned, the role was vacant when we ran for it, for the role that we're currently job sharing. And that, I think, is I guess I could call it a symptom for psychoanalysis. No, anyway, of sort of the kind of, I think, scope for increasing postgraduate infrastructure within the Students' Union. But what that effectively meant is that Vikki and I have done hours and hours and hours of kind of work, just doing that, trying to understand the way that these systems work, understand what's not working, how to improve them. And that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, I suppose physical and emotional. Because it is very frustrating when you send an email to a department and they don't get back to you, and then they do get back to you and go, "We don't know." It's remembering that being engaged and involved is important, but it also is important to work on yourself and your other commitments, and sort of within that to support one another as well. I mean, I'm so thankful that Vikki is doing this role with me. I mean, it wouldn't be, I don't know how possible it would be otherwise, at least in the current infrastructure, which we're obviously trying to amend. So yeah, think about who else can help you. Also think about who's in a paid position to support you. I mean, think about, like, don't ask, you can only ask so much unpaid labor of people, but there are people that are paid to be there for you. So do consider that. So and then I suppose an aspect of that is also putting up boundaries, or understanding kind of what you need in place so that you don't experience burnout and that you are able to be engaged. So at the beginning of this role, we met with many people trying to arrange things, and we had to we decided to accommodate meetings throughout the week at any time. And it's not just about meetings, about planning before the meetings and planning after the meetings. I mean, it's never just a quick conversation, because these are really important issues. And I mean, that's how the work gets done. And that had a knock-on effect of us getting quite stressed and run down, and our work had suffered. So I can say for our boundaries, we've dedicated Monday and Tuesday when we meet with people, because we have to remind ourselves that we're volunteers. We're mostly meeting people that do get paid. So we really need to request people to meet on our terms, while also acknowledging that some inquiries are very urgent, and we may need to kind of step up and support that. In addition to the the meetings on Mondays and Tuesdays, we do our planning meetings on Monday mornings, and we send our newsletter, I think, as I mentioned previously, typically on Tuesdays. So outside of that time, we are PhD students, mostly first.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really great working with Matthew too. There's no way I could do this on my own. It's just so overwhelming. That's not to say that, I suppose I feel like Cameron would probably particularly want me to say here, the role description is not huge for this role, and it is what you make of it, and we maybe are a little bit extra. So a little bit. So we have gone off and we have done quite a lot of things. And I suppose maybe the beauty of that is that we can now tell people who are incoming that might not know about stuff, like, we've done this, and we can, we can pass on this work, this information, this knowledge, whatever. So yeah, partially we did do it to ourselves a little bit. But it has been really good setting those boundaries, and it's been a much more manageable position since then. And we've really enjoyed it. But it's really, really important to support each other, and that goes for whatever you are doing. So if you ask for help, if you're working in a group, try to be really, if you're working on a campaigning thing or something in your department, or making a complaint, or, celebrating something, who knows, be really clear about who is doing what, how much time will be spent on things, and what is required. Often group dynamics can be damaged through
yes, they are definitely your friends. And I don't know if I'm trying to link boundaries and skepticism. But another point I wanted to bring up is being skeptical. Or I guess it kind of goes hand in hand with not taking things at face value. So, and I love the way that this has been written, but there's many urban legends at Queen Mary, particularly around PhD students. And so I think we may have touched on this earlier, but people are very often told that you can't do field work once you've gone into writing up. And by being in this role, by talking to people, we've just found that that's not true. And so if something sounds unreasonable, or that it's not going to work for what you need to complete your research, ask why, ask loads of different people why. And that extends to asking other departments what they're doing, asking us, asking the Doctoral College, heck, even I think asking other universities, or you might have colleagues at other universities, ask what they do, because that is one thing about bureaucracy, is that it can be changed. It is not the only way forever. It just typically has a lot of layers, and you have to sort of get back to the first layer to be able to put it all back together. And come to student council is also something that it needs to be raised, because that's something that I think That's something that I personally would like to see on this communication of talking to people in other departments. The more people you have in one room to talk about their experiences or to feedback on motions that are being presented, it's just going to make the place, the university and the union, better for everyone. But really come to student council. Cannot press that enough on people, especially I think as it may be mostly online next year. So please, please, please come.
Definitely come, because I think as much as we can say, you know, historically there might not have been as much postgraduate involvement in student union stuff, it is a cyclical process. Postgraduates need to be involved in the union for the union to know what postgraduates want. And that's really, really key. So if you think that QMSU doesn't do something for you, tell them what you want them to do. Talk to us. You know, that's how we get these conversations going. And the final point that we really wanted to get across was probably a little bit of a reiteration of things we've said all along. Ask lots of questions. Doing a PhD is such a weird situation to be in. Don't assume that you're in the wrong if something feels a little bit strange. So many times I've had conversations with colleagues and I've said something and they said, oh, I thought that too, but I thought it was just me that felt like that. If you're thinking about it, other people probably are too. So talk to people, say things, and just find out what everybody's thinking. And that's how you find and grow your student voice.
So thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And also, we hope to see you in a rep position next year.
And if not there, at student council.
And by God, definitely at the annual student meeting.
Thanks.
Thanks so much to both of you for sharing with us. And I hope people watching find it useful. It's very informative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, if you've ever got any questions, you can reach out to us. You know, we're elected by you to represent you. So please don't feel like, oh, I don't know if I can reach out to them because I don't know if they're gonna honestly, please, this is what we're elected for. So yeah, never be afraid to reach out. And nothing's ever a stupid question as well. Every question is valid. Should I stop recording?
Yeah, go for that, yeah.